morning to everybody. We are in the class on public administration. The topic today is new public administration. This is an intellectual movement in the United States that took place at the end of 1960s. This movement of the scholars of public administration emerged in the context of a turbulent period in the United States in the 1960s. First of all, there was the Vietnam War, which many American intellectuals and students community disapproved of as un-American war, in the sense that in the Vietnam War, the involvement of the United States was neither a national cause, it was never also the war of protecting the freedom as such, it was a colonial hangover, and the proscription of youth for the Vietnam War was resented by the parents and the intellectual community. Secondly, it was also a turbulent period in the sense that 1968 was the year which witnessed student upheaval in many American campuses and also in European campuses like Paris or Berlin. And the students community were asking certain questions, why they should be proscribed and go to war, and guardians were not also in favor of their young sons and daughters being sacrificed for practically no national cause. Secondly, it was also the decade in which unemployment was assumed a very serious proportion, and the students community as a whole was demanding, especially from the community of public administration scholars, that what is the use of studying public administration which cannot ensure generation of sufficient employment opportunities. What is the use of studying public administration which was basically stereotyped and was stripped in the tradition of Weber, bureaucracy, and a command system of rule of law? So they were demanding a revision, that is rethinking. And last of all, there was intense racial problem also emerging at this time, and the American nation as a whole faced the question of civil rights movement, and therefore the entire environment, academic milieu in the United States was agitating over certain fundamental issues, particularly concerning the study of public administration and its utility. It was at this point when there were certain other preceding issues. For example, the report submitted by Professor John Honey of Syracuse University on the status of studying public administration. It was also the period in which racial questions and the movement for racial equality were assumed tremendous proportion, in which everybody was concerned. It was also the time when President Johnson announced his program of Great Society, and therefore question of liberty, equality, and a decent standard of life was assured by the administration, but which was not available to the society. So it was in this context that at the Syracuse University, Minnowbrook Conference Hall witnessed a gathering of young scholars of public administration, and the leader was a celebrated professor, Dwight Waldo, who had a checkered career in political science and public administration, and at that time he was Albert Schweitzer professor at the Syracuse University. Now, under the leadership of Dwight Waldo, the conference was held in the Minnowbrook Conference Hall of Syracuse University in September 1968. It was in this conference that certain issues were raised and discussed threadbare, and there was a call for rejuvenation of public administration both as a study and as a profession. Under the leadership of Dwight Waldo, who had the distinction of writing his famous essay on public administration at the time of turbulence, and this essay ignited many ideas. One of the major ideas was to look at the deficiencies of the traditional system of administrative theory and the status of study of public administration in different universities. The first point that assumed importance was what is the relevance of studying public administration? I mean the traditional public administration. So the answer was that the society, the American society, needs a new public administration. Idea was that the traditional administration dating back from President Wilson, at that time Professor Wilson, in the late 19th century, and right up to Herbert Simon in 1960s, there were so many stages of evolution of administrative thinking and administrative theories. This tradition witnessed several emphases at several stages in the first decade of the 20th century, second decade of the 20th century, third decade of the 20th century, and in the fourth decade of the 20th century. Basically, the grievance against this traditional culture or traditional system of studying public administration was that it was some sort of a dated thing in the context of late 1960s in the United States. The whole debate was basically concerned with the American system, and therefore the new public administration, this theme was basically an American product of the American scholars who were bent on trying to find some answer to what is the relevance of public administration in the changed context in view of the large number of problems which was bothering them at that time. The second point, which was very important, was the question of social equity. It was a theme on which Professor Waldo and his disciples were very much assertive. They pointed out that American society was suffering from large inequities, and socially there were discrimination and the large number of people in the disadvantaged group in the society. Public administration as a study and public administration as a profession must give an answer to this. Thirdly, there was the values. Against the Herbert Simon's tradition of neutrality of studying public administration, that is rejection of value judgment, this was very much disgusted to the gathering, and they asserted that there must be a value judgment accepted by public administration as a study, as an academic study, and public administration as a profession. There was also the issue of social change, that when the society, any society which is passing through acute problems of social change, public administrators, bureaucracy, and even the scholars of public administration cannot deny their responsibility. They must come up with an answer what to study and how to study. Theoretically, the new public administration movement got inspiration methodologically from what may be called a deductive nomological approach, that is, listening from the systems, learning from the system, and then drawing conclusion. That is the basically issue concerned with the credo of relevance, which was at the center of this Minnowbrook Conference I, which produced the new public administration as an intellectual movement. And it wanted to give a thorough reorientation to the study and practice of public administration. This Minnowbrook Conference deliberations revolved around basically four themes. One was relevance, second was values, third was social equity, and fourth was social change. The point to deliberate is that public administration as an academic study, public administration theory as such, and public administration as profession must prove its relevance to the society. To what extent public administration has an answer to the problems of a confusing time. Secondly, there is the issue of values, that is, totally rejecting the standpoint of Herbert that public administration, or any social science for that matter, should be value neutral. This Minnowbrook I conference, they asserted that public administration must have a value of its own. It cannot afford to be value neutral because of the fact that the immediate need is to think about the interest of the disadvantaged sections of the society. Thirdly, that is also very important, was the issue of social security, that is, how the disadvantaged sections, the marginalized sections, the neglected sections of the society, interests are to be protected, and therefore social equity, that is, as far as possible egalitarian distribution of resources of the nation, should get a priority. And fourthly, social change, that public administration in the society must have a total view of the change processes. So this conference revolved around this program. This is what is called Minnowbrook I, and was given the name of New Public Administration. But this public administration was criticized subsequently by two kinds of thinkers. One was typical of Robert Golembisky, who questioned NPA was basically anti-positivist. It was basically anti-bureaucratic and anti-technical, and therefore in the change situation in society, this was not acceptable. But the second criticism, also very valid, came from Professor Victor A. Thompson, who questioned social equity. The issue of social equity, distribution of resources with society being dictated by public administration or any social science, he described as a torture on society, because there cannot be any final image, final definition of what is social equity. It was in the context of the advent of ideology of less government and more governance that new public administration was criticized, because from late 70s and throughout early 80s in the 20th century, there were three others stakeholders in governance, that is civil society, we may call simply the NGOs. There was also the private sector, and there is also the new god called market. This triad, civil society, private sector and market, they should have more importance, and therefore in this context the new public administration as defined by Minnowbrook I was not acceptable. In the context of this, after a gap of 20 years, in 1988, a second Minnowbrook Conference was also held at the same place, that is in the Minnowbrook Conference Hall of Syracuse University. And this time the participants was a mixed one, not only the scholars, not only the teachers, not only the practitioners of public administration, but also some non-administration specialists also joined, and the deliberations of Minnowbrook II 1988 was first of all technicist, secondly there were more individuals, more specialists, and the main emphasis was put on productivity and performance measurement. Herbert Simon's prescription or perspective of value neutrality and measurement of productivity got support from the second Minnowbrook Conference, and the change in the pattern of public administration curriculum throughout the United States was also questioned, and it was demanded by the specialist participants that public administration as an academic study and public administration as a profession both must take into account the recent economic and technocratic changes which has come in the society and to stay for the time being. Practically, the issue was the questioning legitimacy and efficiency of the generalist bureaucracy, and there was a strong demand that the contribution of the specialist in the governance of the country, not government, please take note of it, governance, that is something which is other than government alone. Government means a structure, government means a system, government means a specialized body of generalists. But governance means that government is nothing but one of the stakeholders in the process of management of economy and social problems. Therefore, governance has a larger connotation, and this Minnowbrook II, they wanted to highlight the role of the specialist and influence of NPM, that is New Public Management, another intellectual movement which began raising its heads during the late 1970s and early 1980s. The background was the emerging leadership of Margaret Thatcher in Britain and President Ronald Reagan in the United States. They provided the solution to the chaotic situation of a bureaucratic society. So the old Weberian form of bureaucracy was not acceptable. This was quite evident in the deliberations of the second Minnowbrook Conference. Influence of new public management was later influenced by another movement which very soon followed the second conference at Minnowbrook, and that was what is called the movement of entrepreneurial government. That is, the idea was that government or public administration must as a whole take note of the fact that because of the change in technology, because of the decline of the influence of organized political movements, because of the increasing role of the private sector, and because of the stakeholders' claim, particularly private sector and market, that their due recognition must be given. And procedure, the idea was the procedural justice is not that important. What is more important is the involvement of other stakeholders in the governance process. And in that way, the Second Minnowbrook Conference negated most of the basic philosophy of Minnowbrook I in defining new public administration, but there were some similarities also. For example, nobody could deny the need of social security, but the definition of what is social security, that is also disputed, and the Second Minnowbrook Conference, there was a theoretical discourse in the context of what is social security in the context of emerging globalization process. Globalization as a process was being very effective. It was led by IMF and World Bank, and gradually it became a strong movement, and many countries of the world could not deny the influence of this globalization process. Argument was for basically a context-driven perspective of public administration, both as an academic study and as a profession. The idea was basically Herbert Simon's, and there was a tussle between Simonians and Waldonian groups, but Waldonian groups received a setback, and in this context we can note and conclude this discussion today by noting that the grand old man of public administration, Dwight Waldo, who was the main source of inspiration of Minnowbrook I of 1968, was asked to give the concluding observations at the end of the Second Minnowbrook Conference of 1988. Now, Waldo was very emphatic on the fact that in spite of many changes, and they were valid, no doubt, pointed out by the non-public public administration specialist, Waldo said that I welcome the new technology. Waldo says that there is no question of denying the role to other stakeholders like market, but he said that at least on one point, public administration gathering and the Second Minnowbrook Conference of 1988 could not deny the importance of social security. Maybe what we said in the first conference in 1968, that is marginalized disadvantaged sections, that has to be taken into account, and that has not been positively discarded. So he asked his followers to go on, don't be disheartened, accepting the new changes of technology, globalization, private sector, and the market, Waldo concluded that public administration is going to be strong in future, and he was confident that the future of public administration is not bleak, rather it is hopeful. This is the stage where I think we can conclude our discussion this morning, and we will take up the subsequent development in the next class, and that is when again after a gap of 20 years the third conference was held, also at the same time, at the same place, that is 2008 September, in which we will see another new context has emerged, and some of the emphases given by the second conference was later revised, and with this hopeful comment, Waldo asked everybody to go ahead.